So today's lesson, we're going to look at anaerobic respiration. And like I said, anaerobic respiration is basically opposite of aerobic respiration in that it does not consume oxygen. It happens in the presence of no oxygen. And there are two forms it can take. One is in animals, and the other is in plants and specifically yeast. So the products that they generate are different between animal cells and plant cells and also yeast cells. But in terms of whether they need oxygen, it's the same. Both are anaerobic respiration because both of them do not require oxygen to break down glucose into a different molecule. Okay, that is the simplification of what anaerobic respiration is. It's basically breaking down glucose into a product without using oxygen. Okay, anaerobic is different in terms of aerobic in that one way specifically. All right. So now let's look at our aerobic respiration and what we learned from it. So like I've talked about in the previous lesson, aerobic respiration is broken down into three stages, right? What are those stages? Can I get? Yeah, put the first one.
First stage?
Yeah, what's the first stage called? Yeah, glycolysis. That is the first stage. How do you remember that? It says the word glyco and lysis. Lysis means breaking down. Glyco is meaning glucose. So glycolysis, right? That is the first stage. What is the name of the second stage, Amalinda? The Krebs cycle, right? And the last stage, can I get Zoe? I'll give you the short form, ETC. ETC.
Oh, the state for electron transport chain.
Is electron transport chain. Okay, there is also another name for it. It's a chemo something, but at your level at year 12 biology, you can use the electron transport chain and it is adequate. All right. So in each stage, a specific amount of ATP is created, and the total we generate is gonna add up. So you guys also need to remember how much ATP is generated in each stage so that you can actually add it up to state the total as well. So what is the amount of ATP produced in glycolysis? Can I get Janita? Yeah, 2 ATP molecules are generated in glycolysis, and it's incredibly important that you remember that because it's going to be relevant for your anaerobic respiration as well. What about for the Krebs cycle? 10, 2 as well. All right. That one is also important to know, but like I said, this one, first one is the most important because it's directly tied into anaerobic respiration. And lastly, the step that produces the most ATP, Abi? Yeah, 26 to 28. And when you add it all up, you get a range of how much again? 30 to 32. All right. That is spot on. Good work, guys. Right, so glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. Here, the reason why it says 4 ATP is basically this step requires ATP. Sorry, it requires ATP to carry out. So what happens is that 2 ATP is used up. Sorry, 2 ATP is used up to generate 4 ATP. Then when you think about how much it's actually generating, it's actually only 2, right? So rather than confusing yourself, I'll explain that again in a bit. And for the Krebs cycle, 2 ATP is released. For the electron transport chain, 26 to 28 ATP is used. Which stage requires oxygen? Can I get Ayman? There's only one stage that requires oxygen. Everything else does not require oxygen. Which one was it? The third one, the electron transport chain, specifically the last stage, okay? The last stage where the hydrogen ions have flown through the ATP synthase, the ATP synthase has spin to make ATP, and then suddenly there's so much free-floating electrons and protons, it needs to bind to something else, or those charged particles will damage the cell, so they bind to the oxygen that is present there to make H2O. Okay, if there is no oxygen present, then this step can't occur, right? And that is actually the reason why anaerobic respiration happens. Without oxygen being present, that means those free-floating protons and electrons can't bind to it. That means this step can't occur. Because if there are suddenly a lot of free-floating electrons and protons and there's no oxygen to bind to, the cell can be heavily damaged. So the cell literally does not allow this step to occur and doesn't let the curve cycle occur because there is no what's the word, oxygen for it to quell all these free floating electrons and protons. So it literally stops the reaction at the first stage. Right? So we're going to look into that. All right. So down, please. So glossary class is lactic acid fermentation. What is lactic acid? Ethanol, and also ethanol fermentation. Okay. So today's lesson, you guys are focusing on the inputs, location, and the difference in terms of the outputs for anaerobic respiration and also anaerobic fermentation in both yeast and plant cells. Okay, there is a difference, yeast and animal cells. There is a difference between the products that they generate, like we talked about. Animal cells produce lactic acid, whereas plant cells and yeast cells, they produce ethanol. Okay, so if you think about it, they are both generating, they are both undertaking anaerobic fermentation, but the product that they are generating is going to be different. Yeah. All right. So before we go into anaerobic, let's just do a very quick recap of aerobic. So essentially, the key thing to note is that aerobic can only occur when oxygen is present, as we talked about, and it generates a total of 30 to 32 ATP molecules. Okay, one molecule of glucose generates up to 30 to 32 molecules of ATP with byproducts of water and carbon dioxide. These two, like I said before, use your own breath as your reference, right? You breathe out carbon dioxide, also water vapor, because of these two byproducts. What do you need to do the process? Definitely need oxygen. That's why we're breathing it in. And we need food to break down to get the glucose to be broken down into energy, right? There are three stages to it: the glycolysis, the curve cycle, and the electron transport chain. The first step is the only step that can happen if there is no oxygen present. In other words, if the cell is not exposed to enough oxygen, it is forced to do anaerobic respiration, and that means that only the first step, which is glycolysis, will occur. The only common phase between the both of them. Okay, so what is glycolysis? Essentially, that is the purpose of the first stage is breaking down glucose into pyruvate molecules. That's the same between both of them, right? The purpose of the first stage is to break down the glucose molecule, the big one, the 6-carbon molecule, into a 3-carbon molecule known as pyruvate. And since it's a 6-carbon molecule being broken in two, it'll make 2 pyruvate molecules. And also as a byproduct, it will release 2 ATP molecules. This process altogether requires, it requires 2 ATP molecules to produce a total of 4. But when you do the plus and minus, considering how much it's using versus how much it's generating, it's a net profit of 2 ATP molecules. So 4 is generated, and out of those 4, 2 would have been used to undertake this step. So only 2 is generated as a net profit. You guys have ever heard the phrase net profit? It's after you minus your expenses. Who here does not know the word net profit or never heard of it? Okay, essentially, if your salary is $100 and your tax is $30, your net salary is $70, because after you've minused off your tax, which you need to pay, you actually get $70, right? In the same way here, even though you can make 4 ATP molecules by breaking down glucose into pyruvate, you needed 2 to break it down. So out of those 4 that was made, 2 is already going to be taken up to break down the molecule. So only 2 is left over to actually be used, right? So Once that has happened, that is when the second stage of whether it's aerobic or anaerobic will happen. If there is enough oxygen, then aerobic respiration, the curved cycle will happen, moving on with the electron transport chain. If there is not enough oxygen, then an anaerobic respiration or anaerobic fermentation will be promoted. So let's have a look at this picture, right? So essentially, we have glucose, we have the glycolysis step, making 2 ATP, making pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And if there's no oxygen, that's when we have anaerobic respiration. And the respiration part will not generate any ATP. The 2 ATP that anaerobic respiration generates comes from glycolysis itself. So there is no energy that is generated in this actual anaerobic respiration stage. Only in the glycolysis step will those 2 ATP made. If there is glucose available, then it will undertake aerobic respiration as we've talked about. Yeah. I think you guys are understanding the fact that what causes it. No, go ahead. What question?
Actually, it produces 2 ATP, but in anaerobic, it does not produce any ATP.
It's so essentially, aerobic is what we want. Oxygen is present. That makes 30 to 32 ATP when oxygen is present. When oxygen isn't present, it will undertake anaerobic respiration, which involves the first step, which is glycolysis, and then moving on to it, right? The first stage, glycolysis, is going to generate 2 ATP. But the rest of the anaerobic respiration actually doesn't generate any ATP. So if you looked at the pathway for anaerobic respiration, because it includes glycolysis as well, we can say that the final product is 2 ATP. Whereas if you look at aerobic respiration, it already includes that 2 ATP from glycolysis and the 2 ATP from the curved cycle, and then adding together the electron transport chain makes up 30 to 32. But for the anaerobic respiration, it only gets to include glycolysis, which is 2 ATP, and the rest does not generate any ATP, so the total is only 2, right? So by adding them up, right, that's how you get the final product, like we showed in this one, right? So by adding them all up, we get 30 to 32. This is for aerobic. All three get added up. For anaerobic, only the first stage is added because the other two can't happen. So only 2 ATP is made for anaerobic respiration. Anyone still confused about that? Why it's 2 versus 32 or 30? All right. So essentially, this picture looks like a lot, but let's go to the simple level. All right. So like I said, right, the second stage and the third stage can't happen without oxygen, right? So essentially, without oxygen present, the pyruvate won't be converted to acetyl-CoA. If it's not converted to acetyl-CoA, it can't undergo the electron transport chain. The acetyl-CoA won't undergo the curved cycle, and then that won't undertake the electron transport chain as well. Only with oxygen, those two will happen. Without oxygen, only the first stage will happen. So what happens in the first stage when there isn't any oxygen, right? So essentially, anaerobic respiration, one thing to note is that it can happen a lot faster compared to aerobic respiration. Who can give an idea of why? Gavin, why do you think aerobic takes longer than anaerobic? Yeah. So always remember to differentiate aerobic versus anaerobic. I think you just said aerobic. Okay. So the process anaerobic is much shorter because it doesn't need to go through the curved cycle or the electron transport chain to produce the final product, which is ATP, 2 ATP. So it's much quicker, right? It's more rapidly producing energy compared to an aerobic. However, like I said before, it only makes 2 ATP, which is incredibly inefficient compared to aerobic, which generates up to 30 and 32 30 to 32 ATP. Its only benefit is that it happens with a short duration of time. So it takes place in the cytoplasm, not the mitochondria. Why is this the case? Can I get Simon? Why is it anaerobic respiration specifically takes place in the cytoplasm or the cytosol versus the mitochondria? We've already learned this in aerobic respiration.
Doesn't the glycolysis happen in the cells?
Exactly. Right? And where does the first stage happen? Glycolysis. It's specifically happening in the gel-like substance within a cell known as the cytoplasm or the cytosol. So this is the cell, this is the nucleus in the middle, we have ribosomes all around, and this is the mitochondria. The cytosol is where the So the cytosol becomes the site of glycolysis. So meaning that it never goes into the mitochondria. So the 2 ATP is literally made outside of the mitochondria. Second thing to note. Okay. Another thing to note that is this process requires NAD plus, right? The breaking down of so by natural itself, the process of glycolysis needs NAD plus, right? The reactants for glycolysis require NAD plus and ADP. That is the reactants for glycolysis, as you can see in the original, right? So you can see here inputs, right? It needs 2 ADP, it needs 2 NAD plus, and also ATP, because like I told you, this step requires ATP to function as well. So it also needs 2 ADP, and obviously it needs the glucose. It is incredibly important that you guys remember the inputs for all 3 steps, especially for glycolysis, because it's relevant for aerobic and anaerobic respiration, right? What goes in? So considering what goes in for this step to occur multiple times, those reactants need to be constantly supplied, right? Meaning NAD plus and ADP and 2 ATP need to constantly be supplied for anaerobic respiration to occur. So for glucose to be broken down into pyruvate, you need to supply NAD plus, you need to supply ADP, you need to supply 2 ATP, and you need to supply glucose. Those are the reactants for this stage, and it will be made into pyruvate. That is glycolysis. Only after then, the next stage occurs, which is aerobic fermentation, where there is no oxygen present. So it undergoes anaerobic fermentation, where the pyruvate is either broken down into lactic acid or into ethanol and carbon dioxide. And that depends on what type of cell is doing the anaerobic respiration. If it's an animal cell like us, like any animal you can think of, insects, huge animals, fish, regardless of what animal we're talking about, it will produce lactic acid. That is a type of acid. Essentially, when we're thinking about an acid, it applies in every way. So think about what are factors that can affect enzyme activity, what are factors that can affect our body function, pH, right? One of them. So essentially, by building up an acid, we are changing the pH of our body, and that can have some downstream effects. I'll get to that in a bit. If you are a yeast cell or a plant cell, you will make ethanol and CO2 instead. This is very relevant in today's society because this is the step that is used in a lot of alcohol production, right? So a lot of the alcohol you know or heard of are using this one step to make that ethanol, which is anaerobic fermentation, specifically done with either yeast or plant cells. So different types of alcohol are made using different types of ingredients, right? If I remember correctly, vodka is made, conventional vodka is made using potatoes. Whiskey is made using barley. And so different types of alcohol are made using different types of plants. And the key thing here is that they're made using plant cells, because plant cells can undergo anaerobic fermentation to make ethanol, unlike animals which only make lactic acid. So this process of anaerobic respiration needs NADH, the charged coenzyme NADH, and it gives back NAD+. And as you can see, this becomes a cycle where NADH is used up to generate NAD+, and that NAD+ is used up during glycolysis to make NADH, and so on. This is gonna support each other. Because anaerobic fermentation requires NADH, and glycolysis requires NAD+. They support each other by giving the reactants for each other back to back. So the NAD+ and H will flow in the cycle back to back, and there will be ATP made as a result continuously, which is 2 ATPs per molecule of glucose. Any questions so far? Okay. So one of the important things to note here is that when glycolysis is occurring, what are the things that are going in? You have glucose, that's the first reactant. Second is ADP. Third is NAD+. And fourth is the 2 ATP that basically allows this reaction to occur. Once that reaction occurs, what are the products? 2 pyruvate molecules, 2 ATP, 2 NADH. And those are the products for glycolysis. Once that occurs, you have the 2 pyruvate. It has a choice of whether it's going to do aerobic or anaerobic. If there's oxygen, aerobic will occur. If there is no oxygen, anaerobic fermentation will occur. And that process requires the reactants, which are pyruvate, NADH, to break it down into either lactic acid or ethanol, depending on the type of cell that is doing the fermentation. If it's an animal cell, it will make lactic acid. If it's a plant cell or a yeast cell, it will make ethanol. Okay, anyone confused about this step? Okay, so essentially anaerobic fermentation requires the whole step. Sorry, anaerobic cellular respiration requires 2 steps. One is glycolysis, and the second one is the anaerobic fermentation. Then only it's complete to make lactic acid or ethanol, and also producing the 2 ATP. Okay, any questions? Nope. Moving on, right? So like I said, right, lactic acid can only happen in animal cells, specifically like humans, where the lactic acid continuously builds up within the cells. Actually, this gave me an idea of what we could do. If we have time later on, we're going to do a short informal practical where we're going to build up the lactic acid within our muscles. Okay, we're going to do a wall plank and see how long you guys can handle that. Do you guys know what a wall plank is? Okay, we're going to try that out, and you can get a first-hand experience of the lactic acid building in your body. All right, essentially, why is the lactic acid bad? Like any acid, it can lower the pH. And we've talked about why pH is an important factor for a lot of biochemical reactions, because a lot of biochemical reactions use proteins. And as we've looked at in the past, proteins are very easily impacted by pH. What happens if the pH drops or increases beyond its optimal range, Mare? What happens to a protein if the pH of the environment is much lower or much higher than its optimal range? What's the proper word we use? Yeah, denature. And if you have to explain what denaturing is, non-conformational change. You have to use that phrase, right? So you have to say it undergoes denaturing, which means that the active sites have undergone conformational change, making it non-functional. Okay, that is why we do not want a low pH in our cells or blood, because if that happens too much, it can essentially become toxic to us, right? So when there is suddenly a high amount of oxygen, Windows. Right. So essentially that lactic acid is a bad thing to keep in our body. So what happens to the lactic acid is that it is brought to the kidneys once there is enough oxygen, and it is broken down. Sorry, it is converted back into glucose and then brought back into the cells again. All right. So it's important to note it is a temporary molecule. It's not something that the body makes to keep for a long time. It wants to just keep it temporarily and then convert it back into glucose when it is ready. And this happens in the liver. You don't need to really know this, but essentially it's good to know that lactic acid isn't stored in the body. It is converted back into glucose, and that happens in the liver. So, like we talked about, there's two distinct stages that occur in a anaerobic respiration, which is the glycolysis, first step, which produces 2 ATP and 2 NADH, and also the pyruvate molecules. And then the second stage, which uses the pyruvate and converts it into lactic acid with the help of NADH, where it does not produce any other byproducts. Okay, no ATP or no carbon dioxide is produced in the second stage. Only the 2 ATP produced in the glycolysis stage are counted. So essentially, if you were to simplify it into one chemical reaction, it would be glucose becoming into lactic acid and 2 ATP. You don't really need to simplify it into anything else. Essentially, it's very rare that they ask you to write down the chemical formula of lactic acid. If they do, usually they've provided it somewhere, so keep your eyes out. Yeah. Essentially, let's look at this picture, and it shows everything I've just talked about. So the first stage, second stage, first stage requires ADP. It also requires 2 ATP to be to flow into it. It also requires NAD plus to flow into it, and the glucose is broken down into pyruvate, generating 2 ATP, generating 2 NADH, and also generating the 2 pyruvate molecules. Then the second stage occurs, which is lactic acid fermentation, where lactic acid is made using NAD plus to make NADH to make NAD plus, and that NAD plus is going back into the first stage to be used again. So that, like I said, and like we've looked at in multiple other topics, the coenzymes are going to be cycled back and forth, right? They're going to become charged, used in a different reaction, become uncharged, and then used in a different reaction. And they're going to happen continuously between them. Okay, this is very common in the different topics that we've looked at. The coenzymes are constantly charged and then used up in a different reaction to give you uncharged coenzymes, which flow back to the first stage to become charged again. Okay, this is very common, and you will see it a lot in the biology that we are learning. So, like I said, right, glucose is made into lactic acid. Lactic acid goes to the liver, made back into glucose. You don't need to know any of this. I'm just including this so that you know that the lactic acid is made back into glucose. Yeah, essentially you don't need to know much about this stuff. Right. Next one is alcohol fermentation, which is basically aerobic respiration that's occurring in yeast and plant cells. And this is specifically towards yeast and plant cells and some bacterial cells as well. But essentially, you don't really deal with those bacteria. Okay. Unlike lactic acid, which is a temporary molecule which is made back into glucose, ethanol is not one of those temporary molecules. In fact, they can't be converted back into pyruvate or glucose. Another thing to note is that ethanol is also incredibly toxic. So much so that You know how you guys drink alcohol that's like 20% or 30%, 40%? The reason why that percentage is so important is that if we drank 100% ethanol, that is basically poison that will kill you. Like that is straight up just poison that will immediately kill you. So essentially, if you ever think about what's drinking alcohol, scientifically you are poisoning your body. Your body just has the system to counteract that poison. So being drunk is your body fighting poisoning. So that's a whole other thing. All right. So cells need to get rid of it immediately after the ethanol is made, or if they don't do that, it will essentially kill the cell itself if it builds up too much ethanol. So same with the other form of lactic fermentation. Alcohol fermentation also requires the two steps, right? Glycolysis occur, and then moving on to the alcohol fermentation. Glycolysis, same things happen where 2 ADP is used, 2 ADP is used, 2 ATP is used, 2 NAD plus is used, and one molecule of glucose is used to generate 2 ATP, to generate a net gain of 2 ATP and 2 NAD plus NADH, and also the 2 pyruvate molecules, right? So essentially, you guys definitely need to know what goes into glycolysis and what comes out so that you can write that down. Second is alcohol fermentation, and this is alcohol fermentation instead of lactic fermentation because this is happening in plant and yeast cells. So when the pyruvate is being broken down, it will be broken down into ethanol and carbon dioxide. So these two will be generated instead of lactic acid for animal cells, and no ATP is also produced. So essentially, the chemical formula can be simplified as glucose broken down into ethanol and carbon dioxide along with 2 ATP. So almost everything is the same between lactic acid fermentation and ethanol fermentation. The only difference that you need to remember are the products. Okay. Other than that, everything else is the same. Okay. The glycolysis steps are 100% the same. And then the second stage is where they differ quite a bit, right? Pyruvate is broken down into ethanol for plant and yeast cells, and they also make carbon dioxide as another byproduct along with the 2 ATP. Any questions? All right. So yeah, we're done. Essentially, the anaerobic respiration is very easy concept to memorize, easy concept to understand. It does not require oxygen because there are situations where we don't get oxygen, right? When you're undertaking physical activity, your body can't get the oxygen it needs, so it undertakes anaerobic respiration. The anaerobic respiration involves two separate stages, glycolysis and the actual fermentation, whereas with aerobic respiration, it involves three steps, which is glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transfer chain. Glycolysis is the same between the both of them, meaning that the same products are generated, the same steps are undertaken. All right. The location for both cellular respirations will start off at the cytosol. But for aerobic respiration, after the products are made at the cytosol, they will move into the mitochondria to undertake the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Whereas with aerobic respiration, it all happens at the cytosol to generate the 2 ATP molecule, because only needs to happen at the cytosol. And like I said, because it's only requiring to do these two stages, it happens at a much faster rate, meaning that energy is obtained much faster compared to the aerobic respiration. Inputs for the two stages. Essentially, if you have to simplify it into one line of an equation, glucose is supplied for both of them, but oxygen is only present for aerobic, whereas the other one does not require oxygen. So essentially, if you were to simplify the input and the output, you would say that aerobic gets glucose and oxygen, whereas anaerobic only gets glucose. And the outputs, like we talked about, for aerobic, carbon dioxide and water, like you can model with your breath. And the outputs for anaerobic respiration is is lactic acid for animal cells and ethanol and lactic acid for animal cells, and for plant cells and yeast cells, there will be ethanol and carbon dioxide. In terms of ATP production, obviously aerobic respiration is much more efficient, generating 30 to 32 ATP molecules because it can undergo the last two stages. The last two stages of aerobic respiration allows there to be a lot more coenzyme generated, which then support the last stage, which is the electron transport chain. That is why they make so much ATP. If those two stages can't occur, obviously you'll make much less ATP, as you can see in anaerobic respiration, anaerobic fermentation, which only generates two. And in terms of how long it can happen, remember that for anaerobic respiration, the products that are generated are not good for any cell. For animal cells, it's lactic acid, and we know what happens when an acid builds up in your body. It lowers your pH, and if it continuously does that, your proteins will get denatured, which is a bad thing. And for plant cells, that's ethanol is being made, which by itself is already toxic to the cell, so it needs to be removed from the plant as quickly as possible. So both the products, regardless of whether it's an animal cell or a plant cell or a yeast cell, are actually bad for the cell itself. So they cannot happen indefinitely, meaning that anaerobic respiration is only a temporary fix that cannot happen for too long, or the cell will experience damage. Whereas aerobic respiration does not make any products that are toxic to the cell, right? The only products that are made is carbon dioxide and water, along with 32 to 38 ATP. Water doesn't do anything bad, and the carbon dioxide is immediately removed from the body through your circulatory system. And as such, it can continue indefinitely, right? This stage is continuing indefinitely, so much so that even right now, all of us are undertaking aerobic respiration in one part of our cell or otherwise, right? It's continuously occurring throughout our life cycles. So, when describing anaerobic and aerobic respiration, there are certain animals, certain organisms that can survive in oxygen-rich environments. There are certain organisms that are not capable of surviving in oxygen-rich environments, meaning that oxygen is toxic to them. And then there are animals that can survive without oxygen, but do better in an oxygen environment. And each of them have their own names, right? For example, anaerobe is something that cannot use oxygen. Obligate anaerobe is stuff that can be killed by oxygen. Obligate anaerobe is stuff that requires oxygen. Facultative anaerobe is something that can grow without oxygen but grows better in the presence of oxygen. Can I get you guys to write down these four lines? Okay, so essentially this is used mainly for bacterial cells and to describe what kind of environment they usually can survive in. Okay, if it's an oxygen rich environment that they are flourishing in, then they are a obligate aerobe, meaning that they require oxygen. If they can survive without oxygen, then they are probably a facultative aerobe, meaning that they can grow without oxygen, but they grow better in the presence of oxygen. Who's still running that? Right. 30 seconds. Then we will undertake our practical activity. It's a good chance for you guys to wake up in the morning. What better way to wake up than to make some acid in your bread? All right, is everyone done? All right, can I get everyone up your seats? Okay, find a spot in the class where you can do a wall plank. Yeah, I know something very out of your comfort zone, but hey, no better way to learn biology than practical experience, right? All right, find a part of the wall where you can basically stick to the wall. It's up to you whether you want to say. I'm gonna do a wall. It's up to you whether you want to. They can't. They never. Yeah, careful though. Drop it first. All right. So essentially, we are going to create the situation that forces your cells to undertake anaerobic respiration. So we're going to do this for about 1 minute, or like does anyone here think they can't last for 1 minute? Okay, we'll see. All right. So essentially, everyone here knows what to do, right? Do I need to explain what a wall plank is? No? All right. So I'm gonna get you guys to do it for 1 minute, and then we will get an we will ask ourselves whether you felt your muscles ache, whether you felt something build up in your muscles, and whether it went away after a while. So you guys can start now. Okay, just hold on and just hang that. Okay. So you can already feel the lactic acid. So let's see if you guys can last 1 minute. Yeah, we've only started. Another 30 seconds. I mean, I am making it a bit easy on you guys. It's not actually 1 minute. See, biology is fun. 10 seconds. See, so what about we make it another day?
No.
Okay, whoever wants to go, make it going. Okay, you're done. 1 minute. All right. So feel that lactic acid disrupting your body and feel it going away after you stop. Right? Once you stop producing lactic acid, you break it down into glucose again. Your body is giving up. Hey. See? Yeah. So depending on whether you could either be solved for two reasons, right? Lactic acid is going to be something that goes away very quickly because once it's being broken down, the lactic acid made into glucose again, you won't feel that pain anymore. If you still feel pain after that, that's more likely in relation to your muscles and whether they've been damaged, right? You get stronger when your muscles get damaged or essentially torn and they heal back stronger, right? That's how you get stronger. But this is talking about glucose being broken down into different things because of the lack of oxygen. That's when you have lactic acid. All right. So you become the best model for you to remember these things, right? Why? What are the inputs for breaking down glucose? You need glucose, obviously. You need to breathe in oxygen. Those are the inputs. What do you get out of it? You get energy. That's what you're doing every day. And you release carbon dioxide and H2O in your breath. Okay, that is aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration, think about any time you do any exercise, right? Like we've shown in this pictures. So literally any three of these activities, you don't notice it, but you're not breathing properly when you do these exercises. Your body is very much focused on doing the activity, so you don't realize you're not getting enough oxygen. When you do not get enough oxygen, that glucose is broken down into lactic acid and energy, and the 2 ATP is it's the only energy you're getting, right? That's why a lot of marathon runners, they are controlling their breath a lot because if at any stage their body starts to just do anaerobic respiration, then they will not be able to continuously run. The whole point is to make your body do aerobic respiration for as long as it can to reduce the amount of lactic acid in your body so that you can keep going, right? If you talk about this to marathon runners, they will actually be very much relating it back to this concept. In fact, if you yourself are a marathon runner, this is one of the most important things you need to remember. How to make your body do aerobic more than anaerobic? You need to constantly supply oxygen. How do you constantly supply oxygen? Controlling your breath, making sure you're breathing through your lungs to increase oxygen, right? Breathing through your mouth versus breathing through your nose. Which one would get you more oxygen? Nose, right? Because you can fill your lungs more versus with your mouth. That's why at first, whenever you do any physical activity, your body will try to breathe through the nose. But because the activity becomes your focus, you start breathing through your mouth, reducing your oxygen intake, increasing your lactic acid production, right? It all relates to each other. Okay, they're all tied to each other. That's why I keep saying you become the best case study to study these kind of things because you are constantly every day balancing between aerobic and anaerobic depending on what you do. Cannot show the names yet. All right. So let's look at this question. Fermentation in yeast produces, fermentation in yeast, what does it do? Can I get 0? Okay. A, it produces ethanol. Well done. Because the keyword here is yeast, right? And we know plant cells and yeast cells, they make ethanol. They do not make lactic acid, so they don't even require it. They do not undertake the Krebs cycle because anaerobic respiration does not even come near the Krebs cycle. And lastly, the whole point of anaerobic is that it does not require oxygen, right? Moving on. All right. Okay. All right. If there is insufficient glucose for cellular respiration, fatty acids can be changed into acetyl-CoA. Each fatty acid X molecule produces 8 molecules of acetyl-CoA. This diagram below summarizes the pathway of breakdown of fatty acid X into and glucose. Number of molecules produced in each step is right. The number of molecules. So this, I know it immediately looks very confusing because suddenly there's Krebs cycle, suddenly there's electron transport chain. But what's happening is in this step here, this is the anaerobic respiration. Where does the acetyl-CoA come from? Is the fatty acid. So essentially, if you're not eating properly, you've probably heard that your fats can be broken down into energy as well. It's not just your carbs, but your fats can be broken down into energy. This is how it happens, right? Your fatty acids are broken down into acetyl-CoA directly, and from there, it will feed the 2 stages of cellular respiration, which are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So referring to the information above and your knowledge of cellular respiration, which one of the following conclusions can be made? So essentially, this question, there's 2 ways you can answer it, right? One is by understanding what the question is talking about and all that, and then trying to understand which answer is most appropriate. That is the way that most of you would do. Second way, like I've talked about before, elimination method. Okay, rather than focusing so much on the stuff being said above, think about the answers, think about whether they make sense at all, right? So let's go through it. Most of the ATP is made in the Krebs cycle. Is that accurate in any stage of cellular respiration? Does it make sense? Eliminate that answer. Second one, pyruvic acid is converted to acetyl-CoA under anaerobic conditions. Is that accurate? Right? The whole point is under anaerobic respiration, it will be made into either lactic acid or into ethanol, depending on the type of cell. It will not be made into acetyl-CoA, so B is out as well. C, no ATP can be formed from the breakdown of glucose under anaerobic condition. Is that accurate? No. 2 ATP is made in glycolysis, so that is immediately taken out. D, one fatty acid X molecule produces more ATP in the aerobic conditions than one glucose molecule. How do you know whether this is true or not? Is you need to read the description of the question. Essentially, here, right? Each fatty acid X molecule produces 8 molecules of acetyl-CoA. How much acetyl-CoA does pyruvate make? So each pyruvate becomes 1 acetyl-CoA. So 2 pyruvate molecules from the first stage are made into 2 acetyl-CoAs. Right here, you can see that 1 fatty acid molecule produces 8 acetyl-CoA. So essentially, this does make more energy. One molecule of fatty acid makes a lot more ATP than 1 molecule of glucose. We already know this. But like I said, even if you don't know this, even if you don't notice this part, by just doing your elimination method, you can actually get to the right answer. And that's the thing about the elimination method. If you can eliminate the answers based on what you know, whatever's left, regardless of how weird or how out of context it sounds, has to be the right answer. Because you know for a fact the other answers do not make sense at all. Okay, so don't let yourself get confused of what they're saying. If you can do your elimination method, you will get to the answer nonetheless. That's okay. Yeah, this one didn't make sense to me. This one isn't even that funny. Yeah. This is like the most cliched biology joke I've ever heard. Even back when I was studying even back when I was in high school, this joke was overused. So, yeah. Any questions about what we've learned today? Okay, in terms of aerobic and anaerobic. Okay, I would highly advise you guys to remember the chemical formulas for photosynthesis and for cellular respiration. Both cellular aerobic and aerobic, remember the chemical formulas. It's going to be imperative so that you can go back. You can also use it as a reference in case other questions require you to know it. Okay, so please take some time to memorize the chemical formulas. Memorize the number of ATP made as well. Okay, that will definitely be a focus. What other things can be a focus? I think for this topic, just knowing that ethanol is produced by yeast cells and plant cells. Lactic acid is made by animal cells. Lactic acid is converted back into glucose in the liver, whereas ethanol is just removed from the cell altogether. The things, yeah, both of them don't require oxygen. That's why it's anaerobic. And they both make 2 ATP, and that ATP specifically comes from glycolysis. Yeah. Just a summary.